It was a day like any other in Applewood, a small town where everyone knew each other and life moved at a gentle pace. The leaves were turning beautiful shades of red and gold, painting the town in a warm, vibrant palette that signaled the arrival of autumn. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the crisp scent of fall and the promise of cooler days ahead. Mrs. Johnson sat in her armchair, reading a book. She was deeply engrossed in the pages, the words transporting her to another world. She enjoyed the quiet of the afternoon, the peacefulness of her home a stark contrast to the adventures in her book. Suddenly, she heard a soft whimper at her door. It was so faint that at first she thought she might have imagined it. Mrs. Johnson slowly put down her book, her curiosity piqued by the unexpected sound. She wondered who could be outside. It was unusual for anyone to visit her at this hour, especially without calling first. Curious, she got up from her chair, her mind racing with possibilities. As she approached the door, the whimpering grew louder, more insistent. It tugged at her heartstrings. Mrs. Johnson cautiously opened the door, her heart pounding with a mix of concern and anticipation. There, on her porch, was a sight that melted her heart. She couldn't believe her eyes. A large, tired-looking dog stood on her welcome mat. His eyes were filled with a mix of exhaustion and hope. He was a beautiful golden retriever, but his fur was matted and he was clearly injured. His condition spoke of a long journey and hardship. He held his head low, his tail tucked between his legs, a picture of defeat and vulnerability. Beside him, a tiny puppy, barely bigger than Mrs. Johnson's hand, shivered in the cool autumn air. The little one looked up at her with pleading eyes, seeking warmth and safety. Mrs. Johnson's heart ached for the two dogs. She knelt down and gently petted them, offering them the comfort they so desperately needed. Without a second thought, she brought them inside, determined to care for them and nurse them back to health. The warmth of her home enveloped them, and for the first time in what seemed like ages, the dogs felt safe and loved. Mrs. Johnson smiled, knowing that this unexpected encounter had brought new joy and purpose into her life. Outside, the autumn leaves continued to fall, but inside, a new chapter of love and companionship was just beginning. Applewood was a quiet, friendly neighborhood. People knew each other. Children played freely in the streets. It was the kind of place where everyone felt safe. But on this crisp autumn day, something unusual was happening. The leaves on the trees were like a colorful tapestry. They painted the streets in shades of red, yellow, and orange. The air was filled with the sweet smell of fallen leaves. Squirrels scurried about, gathering nuts for the winter. It was a perfect day for a walk. But Mrs. Johnson wasn't thinking about the beautiful day. She was focused on the two unexpected visitors on her porch. The older dog looked at her with pleading eyes. The little puppy snuggled closer to its mother, seeking warmth and comfort. Mrs. Johnson's heart melted with compassion. She had always been a nurturing soul, someone who couldn't turn a blind eye to suffering, whether it was human or animal. Her home was a sanctuary for those in need, a place where love and care were abundant. She couldn't bear to see the animals in distress. The sight of their sad eyes and trembling bodies tugged at her heartstrings, making her feel an overwhelming urge to do something, anything, to alleviate their pain. She knew she had to help. It wasn't just a choice, it was a calling. With a determined look on her face, she sprang into action, her mind racing with thoughts of how to provide comfort and safety to these helpless creatures. Crouching down, she spoke softly to the dog, her voice full of concern. "Hey there, it's okay. You're safe now," she whispered, hoping her words would convey the warmth and security she wanted to offer. "Oh, you poor things. What happened? Come in, come in. Let's get you out of the cold." Her voice was a soothing balm, a promise of warmth and safety that she hoped the animals could understand. The dog hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether to trust this stranger. His eyes darted around, searching for any sign of danger, but all he found was the gentle face of Mrs. Johnson, filled with kindness. But the motherly warmth in Mrs. Johnson's voice seemed to reassure him. It was as if he could sense her genuine care and concern, and slowly his fear began to melt away. Slowly he limped across the threshold, followed by his tiny pup. The little one, though scared, seemed to draw strength from his mother's courage, sticking close to her side. Mrs. Johnson closed the door behind them, grateful that they were safe. She knew that this was just the beginning of their journey to recovery, but at least they were now in a place where they could heal. As soon as they were inside, the dog collapsed onto the rug, exhausted. It was clear that they had been through a lot, and now they could finally rest. The puppy, no longer shivering, began to lick its mother's face. It was a tender moment, a sign of the deep bond they shared, a bond that had helped them survive. It was a simple act of love, but it spoke volumes. In that moment, Mrs. Johnson realized the depth of their connection, a connection that was unbreakable. Mrs. Johnson knew she couldn't separate this devoted mother from her pup. She made a silent promise to herself that she would do everything in her power to keep them together, to give them the love and care they deserved. Mrs. Johnson immediately filled a bowl with water and placed it near the dog. The poor creature looked exhausted and dehydrated, its eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and desperation. She then went to the kitchen and returned with a plate of food. She carefully selected the softest pieces, knowing the dog might have trouble chewing. The dog lapped up the water gratefully, its parched throat finally finding relief. Each gulp seemed to bring a bit of life back into its weary body. He ate slowly, regaining his strength with each bite. Mrs. Johnson watched with a tender smile, feeling a sense of fulfillment in helping the helpless. The little puppy, too young to eat solid food, snuggled close to its mother, seeking her warmth. It whimpered softly, a sound that tugged at Mrs. Johnson's heartstrings. Looking at the dog's injured leg, Mrs. Johnson knew she needed professional help. The wound looked severe, and she feared it might get infected if not treated soon. She called the local vet and explained the situation, her voice tinged with urgency. She hoped the vet would be able to see them immediately. The vet, a kind and compassionate woman named Dr. Smith, asked her to bring the dog and puppy in immediately. She assured Mrs. Johnson that they would do everything possible to help. Mrs. Johnson gently coaxed the dog into her car, speaking soothing words to calm its nerves. The dog hesitated at first, but eventually trusted her enough to get in. The puppy, small enough to fit in her coat pocket, snuggled in comfortably. It seemed to sense that it was in safe hands, and its tiny body relaxed. During the drive to the vet, Mrs. Johnson couldn't help but wonder about the story behind these two. They seemed to have been through so much, and she felt a deep sense of responsibility for their well-being. Where had they come from? Who were their owners? She pondered these questions, hoping that the vet visit would provide some answers and a path to recovery for the dog and its puppy. Dr. Smith examined the dog's leg and determined that he had a sprain. She bandaged the leg and gave him some medication for the pain. She also checked the puppy and confirmed that he was healthy and well-fed. Dr. Smith reassured Mrs. Johnson that with some rest and care, both dogs would make a full recovery. When Mrs. Johnson asked about the possibility of finding the dog's owners, Dr. Smith shook her head. They weren't microchipped, she said, and no one has reported them missing. It seems they were abandoned. A wave of sadness washed over Mrs. Johnson, but it was quickly replaced by determination. Well then, she said resolutely, it looks like they've found a new home. And so, the dog and his puppy, whom Mrs. Johnson named Rusty and Sparky, became part of her family. Life with Rusty and Sparky was never dull. Rusty, with his gentle nature and soulful eyes, quickly became Mrs. Johnson's constant companion. He followed her everywhere, to the kitchen, to the garden, even to the bathroom. Sparky, full of boundless energy, brought laughter and joy into her life. One sunny afternoon, as Mrs. Johnson was tending to her garden, she heard a scream coming from the street. Alarmed, she looked up and saw little Timmy, the neighbor's son, who was playing by the creek, fall into the water. The current was strong, and Timmy was being swept away. Without hesitation, Rusty, who was dozing nearby, sprang into action. He leaped over the fence and raced towards the creek. He plunged into the water, swam to Timmy, and grabbing his shirt in his teeth, pulled him back to the safety of the bank. The neighborhood erupted in cheers as Rusty, dripping but triumphant, brought Timmy back to his terrified mother. News of Rusty's heroic act spread through Applewood like wildfire. He became an overnight sensation, hailed as a hero. People stopped Mrs. Johnson on the street to praise Rusty's bravery and quick thinking. The local newspaper even ran a story about Rusty, complete with a picture of him receiving a juicy bone from a grateful Timmy. Mrs. Johnson, beaming with pride, hung the article on her fridge. She had always known that Rusty was a special dog, but now the whole town knew it too. Rusty's act of courage had a profound impact on the community. It reminded everyone of the special bond between humans and animals. It showed that even in the quietest of neighborhoods, heroism could be found in the most unexpected places. Rusty's arrival had not only brought joy and excitement into Mrs. Johnson's life, but it had also filled a void she hadn't realized existed. Before Rusty and Sparky, her days had been quiet, sometimes even lonely. But now, her house was filled with the sounds of barking and laughter. She loved taking Rusty and Sparky for walks in the park, watching them play fetch, and cuddling with them on the couch while reading a book. They had become her family, her confidants, her furry therapists. Mrs. Johnson realized that in caring for Rusty and Sparky, she had received a gift far greater than she could ever give them. They had taught her the true meaning of unconditional love, loyalty, and companionship. The story of Rusty, the hero dog, became a legend in Applewood, passed down from one generation to the next. It served as a reminder of the extraordinary things that animals are capable of, and the powerful bond that exists between humans and their four-legged companions. And so, life in Applewood continued, a little bit brighter, a little bit warmer, thanks to the unexpected guest who had wandered onto Mrs. Johnson's porch on that crisp autumn day.